Morning, everyone. I'll just give it a couple more minutes to let a few more other people join. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Shivam, your host for this session on how to process property owner remittances and send remittance statements to your landlords. I'll just share my screen to share the PowerPoint. I appreciate your time and participation. This webinar is expected to last an hour and will be recorded. By the end of the week, a recording will be sent to you all, registered participants, so you can review the content and share it with others. I want to encourage active engagement during this webinar. If you have any questions related to the topic, please utilize the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and submit any questions you have. I'll be addressing your queries at the end of the session to ensure that we cover any questions you may have. In today's agenda, I'll first be looking at what are property owner remittances and who is this relevant to. I'll then be looking at the three-step process of creating and sending PO remittances. Following this, I'll look at floats and how you can add floats through the property owner remittance process. And then lastly, we'll be looking at how to split property owner remittances when you have multiple landlords that you're sending payments to and also sending statements to. Just to repeat myself, as I'm presenting the webinar and going through the topic and sharing my screen, there's a Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom link. So please feel free to add any questions you have down there, and I'll be looking at them at the end of the presentation and getting back to you. So in the first section, I'll be looking at what are property owner remittances and who remittances are related to. So remittance essentially just means a payment. Therefore, a property owner remittance relates to landlord payments. With property owner remittances, people who would be using this feature and generating remittances and creating statements would be letting agents and property managers using Arthur. This is because you're collecting rent on behalf of landlords. Therefore, you have to show the rent that has been paid in from the tenant. any deductions in management fees you have against the landlord, and any other further deductions such as repairs and maintenance. So this webinar will be mainly related to you if you are using Arthur as a property manager or a letting agent. Also, if you're using Arthur as a rent-to-rent setup where you are managing the property and then paying the landlords a fixed amounts, this webinar will also be applicable to you. So yeah, so please follow the content I cover if you are a property manager and letting agent. If you are using Arthur as a landlord or any other setups where you are not collecting the rent on behalf of landlords and paying the landlords any rent or any receipts you collect from tenants, then this webinar session would not be relevant to your setup. So the first thing I'll be looking at now is the three-step process involved in creating a property owner remittance, and then lastly, sending those property owner remittance statements to the landlord. The first step of the property owner remittance process is paying off the rents, which will generate your rental receipts. So you can see this in the screen I'm sharing. I've set up a property with multiple units. So this is the property level. And if I go into the unit section on my Arthur screen, you can see all the 4 units I've set up within this property. In unit 1, I've set up a tenancy. So this is now the unit level where I can go into the tenancy and click into the tenancy number, which will then take me to the tenancy level. Within this tenancy, as you can see, I've set up 2 recurring charges. This is how your tenancies would be usually set up if you're using Arthur as a property manager or letting agent. The first recurring charge here is a rent charge, which is set to generate for £1,000 on a monthly basis. The next collection date is the date the next rent will be generated by the system. The start date refers to when this recurring charge frequency started generating its charges. So one charge has already generated for 1st of November, and the next charge is set to generate on the 1st of December, which is the next collection date. The second recurring charge I have set up is your management fee, which I've set up as a percentage based on rent received. So what this will do is it will deduct 10% of the rent that has been received from the tenant, and the system will do this automatically through this recurring charge that I have set up. Here you can see who the charges are related to. So this first charge is related to the tenant, and this second charge is related to the landlord, because you're charging the landlord the fee, and here you're charging the tenant the rent. So in this way, you can see which statement these charges will reflect in. This will be going to the tenant rent statement, and this will be going to the property owner statement, which I'll be looking at in a second. Another thing you just have to make sure you are doing is the transaction type that you use for your rent. If you're using Arthur as a property manager and a letting agent where you're collecting rent on behalf of the landlord, and so let's say in this case you collect £1,000 from the tenant, you now have to pay the landlord that £1,000 rent minus any fees and repairs that you're charging the landlord. In this case, the rent you're collecting is a liability because it's payable to the landlord. Rent charge in Arthur is known as a liabilities and is set to generate payable amounts to the landlord. So make sure whenever you're setting up your recurring charge, your rent recurring charge, where you're collecting the rent on behalf of the landlord, make sure you use the transaction type rent charge, because only this transaction type will generate the amount payable to the landlord, which will be part of the property owner remittance you process. Just for your information, the other charge is a direct rent, but that's used by landlords who are collecting the rent, and that rent is their income and revenue. So that rent is not payable to any other third party or any other landlord. That is their own income. So they receive it in their bank account and it just stays in their bank account as a revenue and income. So always use rent charge as your transaction time. So now coming back to the process of processing remittances, like I said, the first step of this process is to pay off the rent charge and create the receipts. This is something you would do on the tenant rent statement. So currently here in the tenant rent statement for this tenancy, you can see we have a rent charge of £1,000 for November. I'll now go ahead and pay off this rent charge from the drop down, pay off charge. And add payment. Before I do that, I just want to go into the property owner statement to show you. Currently in the property owner statement, there is nothing in there in terms of transactions because we haven't processed any rents, receipts from the tenant. So the reason I'm showing you that is because whenever we pay off a rent charge in Arthur, the system will generate two receipts. One would be a receipt on the tenant rent statement to show the tenant has paid that £1,000. And secondly, we'll have a receipt on the property owner statement to show that £1,000 is now payable to the landlord, which will be part of the balance here that you owe the landlord. So going back into the rent statement, I'll now pay off the charge. I'm doing this process manually, but if you are using Xero and your Arthur account is integrated to Xero, you would be doing this step in Xero where you would be reconciling your bank on Xero and matching this rent charge in Xero to create the receipt in Arthur. So if you are integrated to Xero, the receipt would be generated from Xero and would sync back to Arthur through your reconciliation process. If you're using the Arthur bank feed, in that case, you would be reconciling your bank on Arthur within your financial screen and bank accounts. So you'll be going through your reconciliation process here. So this doesn't have a bank feed set up, but when you do reconcile your bank and pay off that rent in your bank, a receipt will be generated from your Arthur bank feed. In this webinar, I will be just paying off everything manually within Arthur, but just keep in mind the process you have to follow if you are integrated to Xero or use the Arthur bank feed for your reconciliation. So like I said, the first step is paying off this rent charge, which I'll do by clicking into the drop down, pay off charge. At the bottom here, then I have a description, which will default to the date, the period the rent is related to. So you can change this description if you want. This is the date the payment came in. I will backdate this because this rent was due on the 1st of November. So I can say that this payment was received on the 1st of November. And then here you have the bank the payment was paid into. So where you received £1,000. Payment method would usually be bank transfer, but you can leave it as your default payment method. And then finally, the amount that the tenant paid in here. If the tenant made a part payment, you can change this amount. So if you only received £900, not of the full £1,000, you have the ability to change that amount. So in this case, I will just go for the full £1,000 in add payment. So once I add payment, this is the first step of the remittance process done, is just making sure you've reconciled all your rents and paid off all your rents. So here we can now see by paying off this rent charge, a receipt has been generated on the tenant rent statement of £1,000. The balance owing from the tenant is zero because that charge has been paid off, so there's no outstanding amount. And like I said, once you pay off a rent charge, it creates a receipt on the tenant rent statement. But at the same time, Arthur will now also automatically create a receipt on the landlord statement here to show that £1,000 is now payable to the landlord. And because we had a management fee reoccurring charge set up here as 10% of rent received, which you would obviously have to set up before you process any payments. Every time a receipt is generated or you go through the payment process, either through Zero or Bank Feed, or the way I've done it manually through Arthur, Arthur will now automatically generate a 10% management fee based on the payment received, which you can view on your property owner statement here. So that's an automatic process through the reoccurring charge. So at the bottom, we can see we owe the landlord £900, which is £1,000, the £100 management fee deducted. In the screen now, we're in the property owner statement. Anything you see on the property owner statement that's showing as outstanding will reflect in the next screen we go to, which will be the property owner remittance screen, which is where we process our landlord remittances. So before we go into that screen, if you have any further deductions that you want to charge the landlord, for example, in November, let's say there was a further £100 that you wanted to charge for landlord for repairs or anything you did on the property that you paid a contractor for, but now you want to charge the landlord that amount, you would add that transaction here as a one-off charge from add transaction. Go into add transaction there. By default, we have a generic charge for this scenario, which is disbursement charge recharge. This allows us to add a charge against the landlord. But if you tick this box, you can also add a corresponding charge against the contractor. So in this scenario, let's say there were some repairs done on the property. So you put in the description, repairs. I've ticked this box, which has now allowed me to add two charges at the same time. One is us charging the landlord £100, which will be deducted from the rent of £1,000. And another charge, which I can now create to pay the supplier, the contractor, £1,000 for the repairs. So you're collecting the money from the landlord and you're paying the contractor £1,000, sorry, £100 for the repair. Here you choose the contractor, and this is the transaction type for the contractor, which would be the same. So both transactions are disbursement charge recharge. So that's why it's called a charge recharge, because you are charging the landlord and recharging the contractor. So you can go ahead and add this transaction as showed below, save transaction. Here we can see now, we now have to pay the landlord £800, which is the £1,000 rent received, the £100 management fee, and the £100 repair, which we're charging the landlord for. It has a recharge tag because we created a corresponding charge against the contractor. So if I now go into the contractor statement, you can see the charge against the contractor. So this is now us having to pay the contractor £100, but that's something you would usually do once you have processed the remittance, because that's the point where you've now collected the £100 from the landlord to pay the contractor. So that's the first step complete, is receipting the rent and paying off the rent to create the receipt, which allows you then to create the transactions on the property owner statement, which are transactions we now need to process as part of a property owner remittance, a landlord payment. So for the second step, you would go into your financial screen here, which I'll open in a new tab, and go into property owner remittance. This is the screen where you now process your landlord payment. You also have this screen here, payable to owner. It's the same screen. So whether I click into here or here, it takes us to the same screen. So here we can see at the top, the remittance has now appeared. as payable of 800. I'll quickly click into it so you can see those three transactions we've processed: the rent, the fee, and the repair, all part of the remittance of 800 we need to process. Before I do that, though, I just want to quickly talk about the different remittance types we have, which you can see here in the left-hand side column. So here you can quickly see the three types of remittances we have, which is remit by unit, remit by property, and remit by entity. So this is based on how you want to pay the landlord. For example, remit by entity means you're paying the landlord one amount for all their properties, all their units, and all their tenancies in a single payment. So as you can see here, this is the landlord's name, and we're processing a payment to the landlord of this amount related to rents received, management fees, deducted, repairs, deductions for all the properties under this landlord. So if a landlord has multiple properties, we have the option of paying the landlord one amount and generating a single statement for the landlord related to all their properties, which we can see here. So that's what remit by entity is. So it all depends on what you've decided with the landlord and how you've agreed to pay the landlord. The second option is remit by property. Remit by property is you're making payments per property. So for example, let's say this landlord had 3 properties. We would see 3 lines in here if we change the setting to remit by property, because in this case, instead of paying the landlord one amount for all 3 properties, which adds up to this amount, we would pay the landlord 3 different amounts, create 3 different property and remittance statements, and create 3 payments for the landlord. So that's remit by property. You're paying the landlord per property. And finally, remit by unit means you're remitting by tenancy. So you have the option of paying the landlord for each individual unit and tenancy. So if a landlord had a property with 6 units, let's say an HMO with 6 units, you can make 6 payments if you're remitting by unit. So you make 1 payment per unit for the landlord. So that's what remit by unit is. If you want to change these settings, I'll show you the process of how to do that now. The best way to change your remittance types is to go to your property owner contact, where you can change the settings so you can decide how you want to set up your remittance screen. So for example, for the property example I was looking at, we have the landlord here, landlord number 1. If I go into contacts in property owners, this is where you change the remittance type settings and go into the landlord contact. So under property owner, click into the landlord, and these 2 tabs are the changes you have to make to change the remittance types. So you would have to make changes in both the property level and the unit level to edit the remittance type. So this property under this landlord, the landlord has 1 property with 4 units. On the remittance screen, you saw that this was set up as remit by unit, which I'll now change to remit by property. So the way you change these settings, you can just sort of memorize how you want to change each tab. So for example, if you want to remit so let's start by remitting by unit, which means you're paying the landlord for each unit and tenancy individually. For that setting, the property level has to be changed to remit by property. So here, remit by property. So if I click that, update, the property level will be remit by property, and update remit by. So that's remit by property. As you can see, the unit level needs to be remit by tenancy if you want to remit by unit. So click on that, update remit by, and here remit by tenants, which is the same as remit by unit, and update. That will allow you to remit by unit. So I'll quickly show you. That's in this tab here. You can see I've changed the settings, so I'm paying this landlord for each individual unit and tenancy now. If I wanted to change this to remit by property, so pay this landlord for all the 4 units at once, the setting would be in the property level. Again, this would still be remit by property. So leave it as remit by property as it is now. And the unit level, we would change this to remit by property. Update remit by, changes to remit by property. This will now allow us to pay this landlord one amount for all units, all the 4 units. If I go back into the remittance screen and refresh this, you can see this has now changed. So currently I've only processed one rent in 1 unit, but if I had processed all rents in all 4 units, I would be making a payment of one amount for all 4 units under this property. The last option is remit by entity or property owner. For that, in the property level, we need to change this to remit by property owner. So change this to remit by property owner and change this level also to remit by property owner, like that. This will now allow us to remit by entity, which is also the same as property owner, meaning that if this landlord had multiple properties, currently I only have one property set up against this landlord, but if they had multiple properties, going back to the remittance screen and refreshing, we can see we can now process a single payment. It's now changed to remit by entity, which is property owner. We can process a single payment to, to this landlord for all their properties, all their units, and all their tenancies. I'll change this back to remit by unit for the sake of this webinar. So those are the 3 settings. You just have to learn for each one what setting you add in both these tabs to change the remit by settings. So property there. And changing this back to remit by tenancy or unit. And then I can go ahead and complete the second step of creating remittances. So going back in the remittance screen and refreshing, I've changed this back to remit by unit now. As you can see, remit by unit. So the second step, as we were going through here, you can control how you want to pay the landlord, and I've gone through how to change those settings. Once you're happy with how you want to pay the landlord, you can now go ahead and process the remittances. So you do that from here, remit, where you can see all the outstanding charges against that landlord will always appear in here. So when we were going through in the tenancy, in the property owner statement, you can see all these are outstanding. So anything outstanding in this statement will contribute to this balance, which will also then appear in your remittance screen here. So we're now processing a payment of £800 to the landlord. So you do have the ability to tick or untick any of these charges. So for example, if you didn't want to charge the landlord the £100 this month and you wanted to charge the landlord the £100 maybe for December when you receive December rent, you can do that simply by unticking this and then going ahead and remitting 900. The £100 will remain there. So the next time you come into the remittance screen, the £100 will be there for you to deduct against the rent. So that's an option you have as well. We'll go ahead and process everything. Click on remit transactions. Remittance date, we'll just backdate this to 1st of November. This is where you're making the payment from. This will always be the same bank the payment has come into. There's a control we have in Arthur where you can only pay the landlord from the bank you've received the money in. So whenever you go ahead and process the receipts, the first step we did, which was creating the receipt here by paying off or by reconciling in your bank in Xero. The receipt you process this, the bank you process this receipt against will always be the bank you have to pay the landlord from. So that will always refer to the bank. So you can't change this. It will always be the bank you have to pay the way, always be the bank you receive the rent in will be where you have to pay the landlord from. So that's the amount and that's the date you're paying the payment. Now go ahead and click on remit to property owner. So that process now, we've created a property owner remittance. If I go back to the tenancy we were working on and go back to the property owner statement and refresh this, you can see now in this unit, we've created this remittance here by doing that process. So now on the property owner statement, everything we included in that remittance has an outstanding of 0 and is remitted to show now the balance owing the landlord is 0, and we have processed the payment to the landlord. So it also creates this additional line here, which also shows you on the statement that you've paid the £800 related to the £1,100 management fee deduction and the £100 repair. So everything reflects on the statement as you process the remittance in step 2. In the final step now, is to go into the property owner payments list. Any remittances you process will automatically appear in the property owner payments list here. This is the screen you are processing the statements and sending the statements to the landlords. So once you've processed the remittance, the next step is now to go into the payments list where you would first batch print PDF. This is creating the property owner remittance. So by doing this process and clicking on batch print PDF, you're generating a property owner remittance statement related to the £100, the £800 you're sending the landlord. So always go left to right. So you can't share that statement to the landlord without doing a batch print. So always batch print first. So click on batch print. And you can have your different templates. If you have a custom template, that will appear in the screen as well. And click on batch print. By doing this, Arthur is now creating a remittance statement in the background that you can now send the landlord. If you have invited the landlord to Arthur and the landlord has access to Arthur, once you click on batch print PDF, automatically on the landlord's login, they will be able to see the remittance statement. So if you prefer to invite the landlord and then just batch print, that will create the statement under the landlord's login. However, if you've not invited your landlords, then you can go ahead and share via email, which will then send the property owner remittance statement to the landlord via email as a PDF. So before I do that, I'll just quickly show you how this statement looks like. As an example. So this is the statement that we've processed. It shows the breakdown of the £800 here. So we have the rent received of 100, have the management fee, the repairs, and then the breakdown of the 800. This is a summary. So obviously if you have multiple units or you're remitting by property or remitting by landlord, it will be split in the statement. So you'll have unit 1, unit 2, unit 3, unit 4, all within one statement. And then you would still have this box at the end, which is a summary, the total amounts of the rent receipts, the total amounts of all the management fees and all the repairs relating to the total amount you paid the landlord. So this is a statement. On the left-hand side here, you can go through other formats we have available for the statement. If you have a custom statement, that will be added in here, which we can create for you. So going back to the screen, once you batch print, the next step is to share via email. Share via email will send the landlord. So the landlord's email will appear there once you add all their details. It will send the landlord a remittance, that PO remittance statement as a PDF attachment. So once you click into that, the next thing you do is have to click into edit body, where you can just write a standard email. If you right click, you can add some fields in. It will auto-populate this, because you can actually do this process for all the landlords as a batch, not one payment at a time. So ideally, what you would be doing is you would be processing all your remittances. Then for all the remittances you've processed, you can select all of them, click on share via email, and then in here, you can right click to add the landlord's first name. It will auto-populate last name and something like please see attached statement. And then you can say something like you'll receive your statement, your actual payment in a couple of days, or however you've agreed with the landlord. So this is a process. Once you click on share all payments, what will happen is it will send emails to all those landlords in the previous screen, to all these landlords, the attachment of those PDF statements with the email you just typed in. So that's the last step of the remittances. So to summarize, the 3 steps include first step being processing the rents. Let's go back to this unit. To process the rents by paying off the rent charges. Remember, should always be a rent charge. Second step is once you've processed the rents, go into the financial screen, go into property owner remittance, and make the process the actual landlord remittance from this screen here. Which in Arthur, what you're doing is you're processing the landlord payment. Remember, that's not physically sending money to the landlord. You're just telling Arthur that you will pay the landlord or you have paid the landlord this amount. It doesn't physically send that money to the landlord. The last step then is once you've processed the remittance, go into the payments list where you can send the statements to the landlords. First process the statement, share via email. Then you can use export CSV, or if you want, you can even do this before. Export CSV allows you to export a CSV of all these amounts with all the landlord bank details, which you can upload into your bank to make physical payments as a batch, to make BACS payments as a batch, rather than you go logging into your bank and individually sending this money out to the landlord one by one. We do have this option. There is no template in here at the moment, but this is a template you would have to get from your bank. So whether you use HSBC, Lloyds, you do have to ask them what template they would accept. Send us that template and we can add that template in there for you to export out of Arthur, upload into your bank where you can make these payments as a batch rather than having to do them individually. So you can do that. You can make the payments first and then print the statements and send the statements, or you can do the statements and then make the physical payments. That's up to you. And then lastly, once you've made the physical payments, we do advise that you go and set them as paid, because what happens is the remittances here will then move into this paid section. That way you can keep track of what you still have to physically pay and what statements you still have to send. So that's quite useful to just be on top of keeping track of which ones you still have to process and which ones you still need to do. So that's the remittance process. The next thing we'll quickly look at is floats, which you can process through your remittance screen. So with floats, as you all know, a float balance is just a balance you're holding on behalf of a landlord. So either the landlord sends you a float amount. So, you could ask the landlord to send you, let's say, £500, and you need to reflect that you're holding £500 as a float for the landlord. And in most cases, you receive that money. You can use that money for repairs and maintenance, just having a sort of a buffer amount of money in your bank for any repairs or maintenance works that you need to do on behalf of the landlord. The second thing you can do with floats is you can create a float balance from the money you owe the landlord. So we'll go through the two processes now. So the first process is the scenario where the landlord has sent you money. So you receive £500 and the landlord has said, this is for your float. This is a float that you can in future use. You can use against any repairs and maintenance work that you need to do for that specific property on behalf of the landlord. So in that case, when the landlord is sending you money for a float, you would go into the property. You can either do this in the property level or you can do this in the unit level. I'll do this in the unit level because our remittance type is by unit, but you can do it in both. So in unit 1, let's say the landlord has sent you £500 for a float for unit 1 of this property. You would go into the unit, go into the property owner float statement, and here we would add a transaction called a property owner float receipt. You would always use this transaction type. So PO float receipt. Let's say £500. The landlord has sent you £500 float. Add this on the property owner statement, property owner float statement. So you're adding this not on the property owner statement, on the property owner float statement with this transaction type always. And this will also reflect in the remittance screen because you are holding £500 for that landlord as a float. So if I now go into the remittance screen, you will see that £500 here that's held as a float. So the remittance screen does reflect float balances as well in this column. I'll just quickly add some charges here as well so I can show you the second scenario. So if I go back into that unit, let's just add a rent in advance or something for next month. So let's add December's rent in there. And let's pay off that rent so we can generate an amount payable to the landlord as we did last time. So this will now generate a rent receipt payable to the landlord and a management fee, as you know. Going back to the float statement now, we've discussed the first scenario where if the landlord has paid you money to hold as a float, you need to add a transaction in the property owner float statement, which is a property owner float receipt, which reflects in the remittance screen. So if I now go back into the remittance screen, after adding those new charges, we can see here we have £500 float, but here we can also see the new rent I've processed of 100, 1,000 and £100 management fee. So going now into the remittance screen, you can now see those two, the rent for December we've received, the rent for the management fee for December as well, deducted. But here we can also see the £500 float that we're holding. So if you ever want to refund this float back to the landlord, let's say, you're either the landlord has asked for this money back, you can click on include 500. That will now allow you to make a payment to the landlord of 1,400, which is that float that you initially received from the landlord. The second scenario is a landlord sometimes could tell you that instead of sending me £900 this month, you can keep £500 as a float, so send me £400 instead. You can process that, you can create that float from this remittance screen itself. So in the next screen, if I go and click on remit transactions, here I can make a float adjustment for £500. And now you can see where out of the £900 we were going to send to the landlord, we're going to hold £500 as a float. So it will reflect in our float statement automatically. Our float balance would go up to 1,000 now, and we'll now process a remittance of £400 to the landlord. This will reflect in your remittance statement as well, because when you send a statement to the landlord, it will show that you received 1,000. You deducted a £100 fee, and now you've also deducted £500 for a float. So now you're paying the landlord £400. So you can make float adjustments from the screen as well to either retain floats or even to send floats back to the landlord. So for example, in this case, if I put minus 500, I'm paying the landlord the £500 float that we're currently holding. If you add, so we're refunding the float. If we put it as a positive, we're retaining float and by making float adjustments. So through this process, you can make float adjustments and you can control, what money you're retaining as float. And if you ever want to send money as float, you can do that as well from the remittance screen. Go ahead and process this. And what you'll see now is this float balance has now adjusted to £1,000 because we had that £500 initially that we received from the landlord. And now from the next rent, we've retained £500 from the rent. So instead of sending the rent across to the landlord, we've retained an extra 500. So now we are holding a total of £1,000 float. If you wanted to go and refund the full £1,000, you can click that and create a remittance for £1,000. I go back into the unit. You'll see on the property owner statement, so this is the new remittance we processed of 400. This line is also created showing from the £1,000, we took away 500 as well. So it is all reflected in the landlord statement. So the landlord will see that you've retained £500 as a float. At the same time, in the property owner float statement, a new line has been created, a retained float of £500. And now your total float balance that you're holding is £1,000. So this is how you deal with floats, either by receiving a float, in the case you add a property on a float receipt, or you can retain a float from a remittance that you're sending the landlord, which is done from the remittance screen. Final thing I'll go over now is split payments. Sometimes you might have to make split. There could be multiple ownership for property, so you might have to make split payments to landlords for the same property. So a landlord could own 50%, another landlord could own another 50%. So you have to make two payments to the two different landlords. You would do this from the landlord contacts. If you go to contacts, property owners here, go into the landlord contact. The first thing you have to do is go into company contacts and add the second contact. So you would always have a main contact, which is the main landlord. And then you would have the second contact here, which is the second landlord. So they could have 50% ownership of the property. So, and they've instructed you to send 50% of the remittance to each landlord. So add the second contact here through add person. Once you do that, go to the split payments tab here and add the remittance charge. So you would have to add two charges. We can call this 50%. split, one against the first contact, do 50% there. You do have to add something in there, so just put 0. But here's where you would also add any tax withholding amounts for overseas landlords. And then second charge here for the second landlord, 50%, 0, save. So now we have created split payments. If I go back into this unit now, let's process the rent. I'll now show you that it reflects on the remittance screen as you having to pay the landlord split amount. I'll just add a manual rent. I have to do that in the tenancy. So in the tenancy, let's just add a rent here of, so rent, say £1,000. And let's pay off that rent again so it can generate amounts payable to the landlord. If we now go back to the remittance screen, you'll see how the split payment works. So going back into financials, property owner remittance, it's already reflected in here as well. As you can see, the total payable is £900, but we're paying landlord 1 and 2, 50% each. So clicking on remit here. And then in the screen here is where you can now see the split payments of 450 each against the landlords. So this is how you can process split remittances. I go ahead and split here, remit here. Let's put a date in there. They appear as 2 separate lines in the payments list. So you would make 2 payments. So here you can see 450 and 450, 2 separate lines. Both the landlords, obviously you'd have different bank details for each landlord, different emails. So you can now make a payment of 50% each and also generate statements for each of the landlords separately and send them out separately. So this is how you deal with split payments. So that's covered everything in the agenda. I'll just quickly have a look at any questions you've raised. Feel free to add any more questions in here in the Q&A at the bottom. I'll be going through all the questions now in a couple of minutes. So one of the questions I've received is, on a unit that's vacant but receiving a monthly holding fee by the council whilst they look to place a tenant, how do I remit that if it's not rent? Okay, so I'm guessing what you mean is if a property is vacant, the council pays you a holding fee, which you need to pay over to the landlord. If I'm understanding that wrong, just feel free to write in the chat. But if you're doing that, what you can do is you can still raise that as a rent charge. So that holding, or you can set up a custom transaction type. Just share my screen. So in that scenario, what you can do is you can either use rent charge because it will still allow you to process a remittance to the landlord. But I understand if you don't want to use rent charge because eventually you will raise a rent charge, you might not want the tenant to see the same, rent charge when that's a holding fee. We can set up a transaction type that operates as a rent charge, but we can call it holding fee or something. So the process would be the same. You would add that transaction type in here as a recurring charge so that when the council pays you that amount, that holding fee, you would pay it off, just like how we went through the process of paying off the rent charge. That will then create an amount payable to the landlord, which you would remit as normal. So you can either use rent charge and the process will work the same, or what we can do is we can set up a custom transaction type for you in here in analysis codes and call it a holding fee um, that operates as a rent charge. So instead of raising it as a rent charge, raise it as a holding fee. And you would set it up like this. So this is how you would set up something that operates as a rent charge, but you want it as a different name for some reason. So liability. So first set up the charge like this, holding fee, charge, debit, tenancy statement. Click on that as well. And the important thing is click on create property owner transaction, which is the receipt that's created when the charge is paid off. So when you pay off a holding fee of £50, it creates a receipt on the landlord statement as payable to the owner. So you can use tenancy receipt as a default. Again, if you don't want the word tenancy in there because it's from the council, we can create a custom one called council receipt for you, which is what the landlord would see. And then you'd have a separate rent charge set up. So opposite type here would be rent received. So this is how it would be set up. Set up as a holding fee, charge, debit, tenancy statement, opposite type, rent receipt from tenant. We can create a custom receipt for you if you want different wordings. Liability, and then the important thing, tick that box there and also tick this box. This box is the box that creates the amount payable to the landlord when this charge is paid off. So create that in there. And then that way you can set up this custom transaction type in here in that property, in that tenancy, sorry, that operates as a rent charge, but is payable to the landlord when you receive the council payment. So you can go into recurring charge. Instead of having a rent charge there, you can set up a rent charge. Sorry, you can set up that holding fee in here now, which works as a rent charge. And then the three-step process would be the same once you've set that up. I hope that's answered your question. Next question. Is it possible to part pay a charge, for example, if the initial setup fee and management fee is more than the first month's rent? I see. Um, so if the initial setup fee and management fee is more than the first month's rent. Yeah, so in this case, if you're, in this case, you have more charges than receipts. Unfortunately, you can't remit a negative amount to the landlord. So I guess what you're saying is that you've the rent that you received from the tenant is not enough for the first month's rent, is not enough to cover the management fee and another fee. Unfortunately, you can't create a remittance because that will actually create a balance here. So let's just add something like that. Let's say you've got a receipt in here. So let's say you've received £500 rent first month's rent. Sorry, 500 rent receipt. But let's say you charge £600 in fees. So you don't actually have enough rent to cover the charge. It's not possible to create a remittance for a negative amount because technically you don't have the money in your client bank account to pay the landlord. In this case, the landlord owes you £100. You don't owe the landlord anything. So in this case, what we do recommend is either you can pay you can wait for the next month's rent to generate. So you can see here the balance is 100, which means the landlord is owing you 100. So you can't actually make a payment for something the landlord owes you. So in this case, we recommend that you wait for the next month's rent to be received. Then you'll be able to process a remittance. The remittance screen will not actually allow you to process a negative amount. Here you can see -100. You can't remit negative amounts to the landlord because the landlord owes you that amount. So either wait for the next month's rent. If you do really need to do something, you can split this management fee, create it for two amounts. You can create it for £500. You can create it for £500 and £100. So you can actually process a remittance for £0. That leaves a £100 balance on the statement showing the landlord owes you money, but you can't remit a negative amount to the landlord. Yeah, so one of the questions is, will we be sending recordings? Yes, we'll be sending this recording sometime this week. So by the end of the week, if you've registered to the webinar, you will receive a recording. Next question. Next question is, can we send a statement to two different email addresses without splitting the payment? No, unfortunately, we can't do that. Currently, the way it's all set up, one landlord has one email address, and that statement can only go to that one email address. So in the screen here, this will be something we are looking into, but at the moment, the one landlord will only have one email address, so you can only send a remittance to a single email from this screen here. You can, however, send it to the first email. If you want to send it to another email, you can print this remittance statement from here. And then from the screen, you can send it manually. At the top of the screen here, send email, PDF, and then here you can type in the second email. So the second email, you would have to do it manually using this process, and the first email, you can do it from the screen here via share via email. Something we will potentially look into implementing two different emails or multiple emails. Another question is, can you send a statement to the property owner even if they have a negative balance? Yes, you can. You can do that. So you can't send the remittance statement because you can't process the remittance. But if you wanted to send the landlord the entire statement, so if I go back to that unit, to show the landlord that they have a negative balance, so they owe you that £100, you can send that directly from the PO, from the unit level or the property level, or however you're remitting to the landlord. So what you can do is obviously you can't send a remittance statement because we haven't processed a remittance for a negative amount. But from the property owner statement screen, or you can even do this in the landlord contact. I'll show you both options. But from the screen here, you can print statement from here. This will download the entire property owner statement in showing all the remittances, all the transactions, which can be sent to the landlord. So this way, you can show to the landlord that they owe you £100. So this is just a statement, the entire property owner statement, all the rents coming in, all the charges, including all the payments you're making to the landlord, and then that's creating a balance of minus 100, which is what the landlord owes you. If you just want to include the two charges that make up that £100 balance, just change the date range here at the top. So if we change the date range here to, I can't do that because they're all dated 27th November. But if these are on later dates, you can change the date range to only show these two transactions. So that way you can show the landlord that they have £100 balance. So that's one way of sending a landlord a statement when you have a negative remittance. The second way you can do it is directly from the landlord contact. So go into the landlord contact, property owners, landlord here, statements, and you can send the statement from same process directly from the landlord contact, where again, you would have an option of choosing a date range. To follow, so the first question I went through was to do with the council payment. Would I create a contact for the council as a tenant for that unit? You can do that. So if you don't want it to show the recurring charge against that tenant contact, yeah, it would make sense to create a contact for the council. So going back into this tenancy, so if you're adding that new recurring charge for a holding fee, obviously this has been added against the tenant. It's the tenant's name. You can go into tenants and add the council contact in here. So add in all the information. Once you add in all the information in here, then you'll be able to raise the recurring charge against the council rather than the tenant. So it will be in this drop down. Still, you'll still have tenant in there, but in here, once you add the second contact, which will be the council, there'll be another option with the council name. So you can add the holding fee recurring charge against the council contact in that way. So it's showing on the rent statement as you charging the council rather than the tenant. Yeah, and then lastly, does the recording go on the YouTube channel? Yes, the recording will be posted on our YouTube channel as well, and also will be sent to all of you who have registered for the webinar. So yeah, you can see it on YouTube as well. I think that's all the questions I've covered. Thank you for your time, and before you leave, once you leave the Zoom link, you'll get a feedback form, and we will appreciate if you add in your feedback so we can see what improvements to make in the future. Thank you.